Hello. Welcome. I'm Claire Edwards from Renfrewshire Council. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the next panel session, which is on the subject of socially engaged arts and cultural labour. And so in this session, our speakers are going to consider issues associated with the labour conditions and duty of care for arts and creative practitioners working in socially engaged practice. So we'll look at how the creative community and the funders and leaders supporting it can avoid precarious labour and build sustainable incomes for the sector. So I'd like to welcome our three speakers. Eleonora Belfiore is Professor in Cultural Policy and Director of the newly established Interdisciplinary Centre for Social Inclusion and Cultural Diversity at the University of Aberdeen. Ellie has published extensively on cultural politics and policy, and particularly on the social impacts of the arts, and is currently researching the labour conditions of socially engaged arts practice. Claire Webster-Sarametz is founder and artistic director of Skimstone Arts in Newcastle. And Skimstone are an artist-led charity with a mission to support diverse artists, people, and communities at risk of social isolation to create work with, for, and about the world that matters to them. And finally, Graham Jeffrey is Professor in Arts and Media Practice and Director of the Protracted Crisis Research Centre at the University of West of Scotland. And Graham's research has often involved participatory action research projects in arts and media at an international scale with young people and diverse communities. So the format of the session is pretty much the same as the last one. So each speaker will talk for about 10 minutes on 2 interlinked questions, and then we'll have a discussion at the end. So if you have any questions to pose to the speakers, please just put them in the Q&A box on your screen and we'll pick them up. And so the 2 questions that our speakers will be pondering are, what are the current key issues concerning cultural labour conditions for professional artists working in publicly funded, socially engaged arts practice? And that's artists in any art form, heritage, film. And secondly, how can working conditions for artists in socially engaged arts practice be improved so that both artists and communities thrive? Okay, so I shall hand over to Ellie. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Claire, and thank you for having me here. It's lovely to take part in an event by a fellow Scottish university. I'm thrilled. I've not long been based in Aberdeen, and I'm still thrilled to be able to say I'm part of Scottish academia. So I think I'll keep this very informal because I think that the really valuable part with this will be the conversation afterwards. I think it's worth saying that my interest in labour conditions of artists is, I guess, relatively recent, in the sense that I have been more interested, or more working more around, as you were saying, cultural policy, and I was interested in the work that artists do with communities, I guess indirectly, because I was interested in the ways in which that work, that engagement, and the supposed measurable benefits that can derive from it, how they've been seized upon by organisation, the sector, policymakers, justify and make the case for the arts. So, and my issue with all of that has been that my concern is that is not the best way of talking about socially engaged arts practice, and that it puts too much pressure and expectation on that kind of work and the people who do it, and also that that level of explicit instrumentalism wasn't really in line with the ethical drives of the people who do the work. And it riled me, if I'm honest, that the work with some of the most disadvantaged people done by artists who are not paid massive salaries would then be recycled, used up in big organizations own narratives of impact and cultural value as a way to justify their large funding and large budgets, of which both the communities and the socially engaged practitioners would really get the crumbs. So the whole thing just didn't sit very well with me. And it was during a project that was about something else entirely. I was looking at issues of cultural value and politics of representation, looking at one particular group, the Gypsy and Traveller community in Lincolnshire, and how, how through such a heritage lottery fund, they were trying to reclaim the power and authority to bestow cultural value on their own practices and their own traditions and themselves as a group. And the thing that really struck me was how in all my interviews with artists, even though I wasn't really asking about their working conditions, I was not interested, that wasn't the thing. It became apparent that there were patterns of overwork, of not being paid fairly, and that talking to the artists, this didn't seem to be an issue specific to the project, although, there were elements where, they hadn't quite fully realized that the added complication of working with a group that couldn't be trusted to always be in the same place. And, there was some specificity to do with that particular project that actually, when I was sort of asking, but why, it was clear that this is just how that we used to work. There was nothing particularly shocking about this project. It wasn't a particularly badly managed project or a particularly nasty funder. This is how it was. And I was really troubled by these endemic issues. And I know that a lot of work has been done around payment and artists not being paid for fewer hours than they work, or not having, some of their costs covered. But the thing that really struck me was, alongside all of that, which is real, and I don't want to for a second suggest that it's not important, I pretty soon came to realize that that's just part of the project, or what I call the hidden costs of engaged arts practice. Because it was clear to me that there was a psychological, emotional load that these artists were carrying with them, which on a human level felt just too much. Because, of course, the people who do this kind of work do that because they have motivation other than financial ones. Otherwise, they'd be doing something else. They also have, I think, motivations that include but go beyond just artistic motivations to do with self-expression. There's clearly a profound commitment to ethical values of participation, of giving voices to communities that don't always have one that is listened to. There's a political drive. There's all of these additional elements to what makes an artist do that kind of work, which meant they would develop this sense of responsibility for these communities and their participants. And that was what made them go well above and beyond the call of duty. And I think it's precisely the funders' awareness that people will do that, they will not want to let the communities and participants down, that allows for this to have become an endemic issue. And I think my concern is that I see these getting worse, because on the one hand, the world is coming out of an unprecedented traumatizing experience, collective traumatizing experience. I think it's fair to say that we know by now that even though it was a traumatic experience for all of us, and it was, difficult and challenging for all of us, it wasn't equally challenging and traumatizing for all of us. And that there'll be a lot of trauma, a lot of stuff to process in the future. And I can already see that the demand for the kind of skills and the kind of ways of engaging that artists can provide will be even more in demand, which is good. But it will be good only if it's done properly. And I'm not sure that that's the case, largely because there is less money in the system. But also I think, and that I think would be the message that, key point I want to make, is also the case that a lot of the welfare services that used to surround the work that artists did, and the kind of help structures and skills and facilities that supported communities, and the artists could, rely upon to support them in their caring for the communities. A lot of them have gone. And so the artists are, almost the last one standing sometime in providing that care. And there's a lot less skilled people for them to turn to direct people to signpost services, because they're not there. And that kind of worries me, because I think we face a possibility where their range of expectations for what artists will do off their own back and off their own willingness will increase, and then there'll be less places for them to get the support that they need in looking, in caring for those communities. But but alongside that, I am not sure we're having the right conversation. Did I? My line went funny, so I hope you haven't lost me. I'm back. I apologize. So alongside saying that, I think, life is getting tough, and welfare services are getting cut. So artists have fewer support mechanisms to help them care for these communities that they work with. I'm worried that we're not always having the right conversations, and I'm worried that we're not talking about power enough. And I think we need to be more honest about power. And what I mean by this is sort of twofold: that there are power structures at play within society, and so I guess I'm worried in the future we're going to see more of that rhetoric around artists working with community and socially engaged practice somehow solving the post-COVID problems. And I'm worried that, much like it's happening a little bit in health and social care, these will lead towards the individualization almost of problems. And the truth is that the kind of people who are often involved in creative activities with socially engaged artists are people who are facing multiple forms of exclusion, disadvantage, and so they are suffering from a whole host of social problems that have to do with the way the society is organized and the economy works. So there are social issues that can only be solved, addressed and solved by social collective solutions. Now, engagement in creative activities facilitated by an artist might be part of the solution, but it cannot be the solution. So I'm worried about a whole new season of us placing absolutely unrealistic expectation on artists, because we don't want to address the fact that there are winners and losers in our society, and we're not willing to really address the problem that are keeping some people on the losing side. That's not the artist's sole job to fix. And that's my main thought.
Thank you so much. That's a fascinating start that Claire can pick up on. So Claire, over to you now.
Thank you very much. And again, it's great to be part of this symposium. Really got me thinking when I was reading the article from Eleanor, and also my reflecting on our journey as well. So yes, founder of Skimstone Arts. I've been a self-employed artist working in areas of passion, I would call it, really, people who matter to me, but through the lens of the art, because art matters to me. That's what I am, is an artist. And in that 22 years of being self-employed, 14 years ago, I founded Skimstone Arts in our garage at the bottom here, because I was actually sick of saying goodbye to people after such a short space of time, people that actually you'd really journeyed with. And from there, yes, we have really grown. And during the pandemic, we actually kept 42 freelance artists in work. We didn't furlough anyone because we're all still self-employed in the company, moving towards an interesting pay structure going forward. 6 freelance staff that we continue to work with. We had 42 people also working in paid assistant project manager roles, and we had an audiences and co-creators and listeners of about 5,000. Why and how did we do this? It's because we actually cared about those that we were already working with, which were already, by society's terms, at risk of social isolation. They didn't choose to be. It's society that places them in that category and label. And that politically and socially matters very much to me and the amazing team I work with. So we believe very much in art because it's artist-led, but equally we believe in a way of working that we always say is working with. So we won't work together. We don't make work for, and we don't make work that says, oh, that's your bit, this is our bit. It's ours. So there's an equality and an equity and an autonomy within that process. And we refer to people we work with as co-creators. So we're not making everybody an artist, but at the same time, everybody has a right to create. And that for us is really important in terms of recognition and terminology. So we'll often say when we launch stuff on our own Skimstone Radio, well, this is a piece that was created by, and we will name everybody that was involved in it, including those who've got professional arts practice and those who could be emerging within their practice, or those who are community, if you like, what people would call beneficiaries, we call co-creators. So just giving you a little bit of background there. So I'm going to move on to the 2 questions now, because these are really, really fascinating. Okay, current issues. How do I get these into 5 minutes? And I've got another 5 minutes for the other question. The first one has to be short-term funding. When you have funding that gives you 4 months to work in some areas or with people who have complex situations already, out of respect for wanting to collaborate with anybody, you need time to build up trust and relationships, getting to know people, them getting to know you. How is it that we try and operate a sort of in residency model? So we actually go and sort of, if you like, live alongside rather than drop in and out. The studio that we have is very much an open studio practice where people know that, and it was deliberately chosen each time we've moved. Our current one was knocked down about 6 months ago by the rich Reuben brothers who've making this really complex development now. We went deliberately to a more community-based setting. So we're not in the garage. We haven't been in the garage for 12 years. We've kept growing. So our studio is accessible. It's meant to be for us to create scheduled work. Obviously, we can't have everybody calling in all the time because actually we've got a very busy program, annual program. But what we look for is for project funding that isn't just about your project. It's also understanding the need to have a core team that provides stability. And as part of our core team, we involve some of those that we're actually working with, like our young people, who are part of our Young Artists Collective, who some of them have been with us a few years, have now trained in project management and also as assistant project managers to be part of that key team. We've had a leadership team with them for about 10 years, and they influence quite heavily what happens in our company. So short-term funding doesn't work, nor does the numbers game. I'm sorry, but I have got to the stage in my career where I'm not afraid to say, I'm not ticking your numbers game box. I'm not going to work with 45 young people when actually I'd be patronizingly saying, oh, yes, if we just do one workshop, we've changed your life. That's not our aim. Our aim is to look at, listen, learn, watch, observe, think about the right skills of performance, film, photography, music. What is it that people are responding to? And how can we then go on a journey that actually means something when we create? So I will say to funders, we could work deeply between, say, 10 and 15 people, but we might have included up to maybe 30 or 40 people. If you're looking at a festival, yes, a lot more in terms of a partial engagement, but I am not playing the numbers game. And I think that helps to give us our residency model of, for example, on the Biker Estate here, with well known across the UK for its poverty and life challenges and so on. But society is there. We hung out in the cafe for months. And I kept saying to the funder, we're really getting somewhere now. People are beginning to come in. and actually work with us. So we got extended funding because our responsibility is to document carefully what is actually taking place to demonstrate this connection. This leads me into what the responsibilities are, and it's already been referenced in some of Eleanor's work. I think there's a lack of training around responsibility. I think my learning curve itself has been very much around what responsibility can we realistically have. Our job is not to save the world. Our job is we can't put mental health suddenly right. And I get angry when actually it's the arts on prescription that's our job. It's not. Our job is to help people to look at the world in a new way, to reconsider their narrative, to question their label as a migrant, as a youth, whatever. How can we readdress that through making something that we're really proud of, that has our story embedded, but has actually made that story more universal? And so you're looking at a much bigger impact. Now, I think training is needed to help artists. We offer training. I have artists, emerging artists and so on, where I talk to them about boundaries. It's not relevant for somebody you're working with to be able to ring you on a Sunday. It's not. So we have to look at what that really means. We embed pastoral care across all the work we do. And what our pastoral care means for those who really are struggling, who may have suicidal thoughts, who may feel that they're just giving up, who haven't spoken to anybody for a week between our times with them. We offer between 10 and 15 minutes of checking in, listening, summarising. We're not there to fix, but what we can do is actually be a signpost to the right organisations whose job it is to do that alongside ours, because we network. And what happens there is you've then got a sense of, at the end of that 10, 15 minutes, you say, so where are you at with your lyrics? Can I just check in on where you were at from? So I know you've got your chorus, so you're back into purpose and you're back into the work we're doing creatively. What's the schedule for your exhibition again? Can we have a chat about how that's going to work? So you move from the crisis back into, now there are circumstances, and I've got them on one hand, where we had to stop a session and I had to take somebody who was going to knife himself to the RVI and sit with him. That was a one-off, and talked him down, and he got his 5 minutes on the phone with a mental health worker. That's extreme. I've got a background in dealing with some of that, but our other artists, it's very much around, we wouldn't put them in a vulnerable position like that. And we work in pairs. And we work in pairs for that reason. And we say to our funders, that's why we work in pairs, because we are working with vulnerable people who sometimes need some extra support. But the best responsibility is when you've got your partners also providing that support network. So I'm going to give you an example in the second question. I'm going to move on now. Burnout is a third issue. I've actually got a bloodshot eye. I don't know if you can see it. I'm exhausted. It's got a really hectic week at the moment. And I have to practice self-care in order to mirror to the rest of the people who are working with me, time out. Burnout and boundaries are really important. We've got to make sure that we go back to an understanding of what is actually a 7.5, 8 hour day, and not do what we're always conscious of doing is 10, 11, 12 days, hour days. And I'm being a complete hypocrite. If anybody was here now, they're going, we've just been doing that. I can't do that long term. We have to look at self-care in all this. It's hard when those you are working with actually you are so committed to. And sometimes editing work that takes longer, you want the very best. I'm a real stickler for quality. So my standards are very, very high. So then I have to think what's realistic. So I have to go back to that. The only thing is that when you get somebody you've been working with who's had half their face removed by cancer and has been really bedroom bound, make a piece of really beautiful poetry on WhatsApp with you, and it goes out on Skimstone Radio, and they ring you at 9 o'clock at night because they're awake to say what it had meant to them. Okay, you take that phone call, but that's a short phone call and you make a choice. So moving on, the big issue again, I'm going to talk about is time and resources. We need better investment in time, understanding the flexibility of funded projects, because sometimes a project can be slower to get going, People are coming out of, being bedroom bound already, but sometimes they need that sense of strength to be able to just be able to go. Now, I've only done the first question, so I'm going to have to summarize my second question onto you very quickly. Improving conditions, I'm going to bullet point. Longer term investment. 1978, the artist Sue Baden in Eleanor's report said we had to do this, and that was in 1978. Can we address inequality? Please, starting to look at where we need better investment to include those that we want to work with, because diversity should be at the heart of everything we're doing. But better development and investment in the support networks. A very quick example is St Peter's Church, where I'm working with Lived Refugee Experience group, and I've got a brilliant surround of networks there who help to do some of the project management. They're volunteers, but they do some of the project management. They put the minibus to get them to perform at the different venues that we're performing at this week. All that stuff takes time to invest in, but boy, is it worth it. And what a wonderful joy for everyone to be able to support together. Value those partnerships. Value the fact when you're working with social action and you're working with universities, and in our case, the Elders Council, as an example, that actually the learning is much richer and so is the impact. And finally, looking at, we now do full cost recovery that includes emotional and practical time. We think to value everybody that we work with, we need to actually know what it costs. And why do we do all this? Because we still want to take risks. We still want to push boundaries of what is possible. We don't want to be repeating projects or workshops. We've never done that. We want to think about, well, how do we respond to the world that matters to all of us today? We want to be putting on a full-blown Unity Festival that's for anybody across the world. How is that going to be resourced properly, make a difference, and actually for everyone involved to feel proud of it? Do I want to be a victim of being part of a socially engaged practice? No, I want to be, and with everyone I work with, an instigator of change, of value, to challenge, to bring in equality, so that actually the difference we are making is much longer lasting. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire. That was so insightful. And I think just putting such a personal face on what are so many kind of common issues, I think, for many artists working all over the country. Graham, it's over to you to pick up on our two questions.
I'm going to do my best to be brief, and I've got a lot of bullet points on the screen in front of me. So echoing what Claire and Ellie have already said, we have this very unstable situation with policy and funding and an awful lot of short-termism, and that's often, as Claire acknowledged, isn't the fault of the funders and commissioners, because they're operating within policy frameworks which are very unstable and constantly changing. So yeah, it's great that you've got security of money to 2024, but that's actually only 2 years out, and what people really need is long term. And if you look at the the most successful arts organizations, they have this ability to be very flexible and tactical and adaptive and jump from one thing to another. But that in itself is a huge burden of entrepreneurial, whatever, social enterprise, whatever you want to call it. And that's what Mark Rimmer, my colleague at UEA, calls often chameleonic practice. So people become adept at jumping from one policy to agenda to another. You want social inclusion? We're doing that. You want health improvement? We're doing that. You want mental health? We're doing that. And that's all very well, but there's a whole set of very complicated histories and genealogies of this kind of socially engaged arts practice, which is also often very, very misunderstood or just under articulated. And we have to remember that a lot of the community and participatory arts movement of the 60s and 70s came out of a radical community politics. It was out of a politics of resistance over appalling housing conditions, bad neighborhood environments, difficulties in people accessing services. It had a campaigning orientation. It was Black and ethnic minority people standing up for rights. It was women's cooperatives talking about access to filmmaking. There's a radical politics in the community arts movement. And of course, that radical politics tends to get rather blunted when most of the money is coming perhaps from the people, I won't go into the history of it, but you know, we can talk about the way in which the community arts sector, if there is such a thing, and I think that is possibly debatable because there's all sorts of different, as I say, histories and genealogies and trajectories of this work, how that is kind of rather, you know, tactical and ambiguous relationships, as is necessary with the funders and the commissioners of the work. So going back to that point at the beginning about questions of power, we should always be asking the question, who's paying for this work? What do they want for it? Why are they paying for it? And of course, that's then what conditions the way in which the people doing the work talk about it, because they have to kind of articulate that work in the discourses of the power that is coming from that is shape the sort of policy shaping of the way that that works. They say we're doing neighborhood regeneration, we're doing community development, we're doing you know, we're doing mental health improvement, whatever it is, and all of those kind of languages. But there's also a kind of another side to the community arts movement, which is about spontaneous, anarchic, DIY, do it yourself, and empowerment. That word empowerment, which is about people themselves having their own cultural infrastructures and having their own means of expression. So there's that tension between top down and bottom up that I think is always unresolved in all of this work, and that practitioners have to walk a very fine line on. And that doesn't matter where you are in the system. It's probably applies. You probably feel a bit like that if you're a local authority arts officer, as much as if you're on the receiving end of some of this funding as an artist. You're still walking these lines and navigating these overlapping discourses. So it's I do think we have to sort of shouldn't just think about community arts practice being about complying with official narratives, about tips of place and regeneration, but in some cases challenging them. But of course, that's where the boundary again between art and activism and art and politics starts to get more blurry. Because if you're passionate and highly engaged and really committed to your community, you are not going to be just willing to just work for 5 hours a day. You are going to go over and above, but not everybody has the time or the resources or the money to be able to do that. A lot of the people who are at the very sharp end of the most, you know, unequal and divided society are basically struggling to kind of keep their food on the table. So that's not an answer either. But there are those kind of questions there about the kind of the need to balance kind of official policy and approach to arts development with an understanding that actually what makes places interesting, what makes them edgy, what makes them worth visiting, what makes them different is that complexity of locality, of cultural identity, of expression and all the rest of it. That's why people want to go and visit different parts of the world to see cultural difference and experience difference, but just not, you know, allowing it just to be commodified and sort of repackaged as sort of local color for affluent tourists to experience does not solve any of the problems of local of community cultural development. So there's all, you know, there's complicated politics about that. So there's also then an ambiguity in this idea of the I suppose in the gift of economy. I suppose, you know, I worry that if we consider the arts as a kind of a form of public service, which is I quite like the idea of the arts as, you know, a cultural service for the community. You know, where it gets embedded across different sectors, it's embedded in education and health and social care. It's commissioned, you know, art to take their place alongside other sectors providing community services. But is that actually just, you know, really replacing what asking the voluntary and the community sector to replace what rights and entitlements people actually might have? You know, people have a right to decent housing, decent work, fair wages, good treatment, you know, living in a place that's, you know, not horrible. And that's what a lot of community arts organizations are very concerned with, dealing with that on the ground. But they cannot replace actually large scale public investment. That can't be, you know, be replaced by voluntary and community activity. Having said that, you know, lot of very interesting places have been developed through these kinds of spontaneous, do-it-yourself, what might you call it? You know, interesting, you know, activities which are kind of outside or oppositional to kind of official culture. So there's that kind of line between the official and the unofficial, the formal and the informal, which I think is worth thinking about. So what keeps artists doing this work? You know, how do they actually earn a living? And I actually think that's an under-researched question. Like, people talk about mid-career artists or professional development, and they talk about cultural leadership, and they talk about cultural enterprise. And yes, we've got a bank of case studies about all of that. But I actually think there's a lot more work needs to be done just about the kind of career trajectories and lives and ways in which practitioners who are always doing this boundary crossing and border crossing work. It goes back to that classic book, Henry Giroux book, Border Crossings, from 1992. It's like one of my absolute kind of touchstone texts. This is boundary crossing and border crossing work. It requires mediation, negotiation. These are what some people might call cultural intermediaries, but it requires a sort of entrepreneurial mindset, but also kind of inventiveness and a kind of activist orientation. So what is it that keeps people at that work beyond just tenacity, and how do those careers unfold, and what would be required to allow more people to do that? And I suppose final point, and I'll shut up. Another way I've been trying to think about some of this work is as maintenance work. It's sort of maintaining social fabrics, infrastructures, the ethics of care. It's human infrastructure. It's very, very important work. The worry is that as the local state and the official infrastructures get hollowed out, is that community arts organizations, or the voluntary sector in general, or communities who are under-resourced, have to bear the burden of all of that without actually getting any recognition for it. So the work that we've been doing in India, where we have a sort of a artist-led urban lab in Dharavi, which is kind of, you know, famous for its kind of urban informality. One of the things we've kind of been thinking about is that lots of arts-based learning, which is about kind of deep work involving identity, story, narrative, rights, telling stories, and representing people's experiences, redesigning and rethinking the way in which people experience their neighborhoods. But there's also all the incidental benefits of that work. The fact there's running water, a decent toilet, people get fed, the fact that people are taking an interest. That is also, it might be incidental, but it's actually critical for the kind of self-esteem and the kind of sense of possibility for the participants in the project. So anyway, I suppose it's those tensions and ambiguities I'm interested in exploring. I mean, I'll shut up there, but I think, you know, lots and lots to think about.
Thank you so much, Graham. I guess that's the thing. It's a really complex issue, and we've covered a lot of ground in terms of certainly the issues and some of the solutions as well. So I guess, you know, just as a quick summary, and then we'll have a look at questions, issues raised, essentially about power, how we talk about power, short-term funding, what the support structures for artists and indeed